When I pulled up to my lake that morning, the first thing I saw was a sign hammered into the ground. HOA order. Fishing prohibited until further notice. I stood there staring at it for a second, trying to figure out why my homeowners association thought it could ban fishing on my property. Then I noticed the fish. They were floating along the shoreline, dozens of them, belly up. That's when I heard a truck door slam behind me. Two workers were loading empty chemical containers into the back of a pickup parked near the trail. I walked over and asked them what they were doing. One of them shrugged and said, "HOA board ordered the lake treated this morning. Residents said people were fishing too much, so they wanted to reset the fish population." For a moment, I honestly thought he was joking, because the HOA had just poisoned the lake, the same lake they believed belonged to the neighborhood. The only problem was, the entire lake, including the water rights, legally belonged to me, and they had absolutely no idea what kind of trouble they had just created for themselves. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 54 years old, and I've lived on the same piece of land my entire life. My father bought this property in the late 1970s when the area was nothing but open farmland and dirt roads. When he passed away, the land came to me. It's not a fancy place, just a modest house, a few acres of pasture, and the one thing that makes the property special: a natural spring-fed lake that sits right in the middle of it. That lake has always been part of my life. My father taught me how to fish there when I was a kid. In the summers, my children used to swim off the small wooden dock we built years ago. Every once in a while, a neighbor would stop by and ask if they could fish for the afternoon, and I'd usually say yes. For decades, it was quiet. Then about 10 years ago, a large housing development appeared on the land just east of my property. Hundreds of homes went up almost overnight, and with them came a brand new homeowners association. At first, I barely noticed them, but slowly, the HOA started acting like the lake next to their neighborhood belonged to them. Residents began walking along the shoreline, fishing without asking, even clearing small paths through the brush. One afternoon, the HOA president said something to me that stuck in my head. "This lake is basically part of the community now." At the time, I thought she was exaggerating. I didn't realize she actually believed it. The first real confrontation with the HOA happened about 2 years after the subdivision was finished. I was down by the lake one afternoon when a small group of residents walked across my field carrying fishing gear and folding chairs. That by itself wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the woman leading them. She walked like she owned the place, confident, loud, already talking before she even reached me. "My name is Karen Whitmore," she said, extending her hand like she was introducing herself at a business meeting. "I'm the president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association." Karen looked to be in her mid-40s, perfectly styled hair, sunglasses perched on her head, and the kind of tone people use when they expect to be obeyed. She gestured toward the lake behind me. "We've had several residents asking about fishing access here. Since the lake borders our neighborhood, we're organizing it as a shared community amenity." I remember blinking at her for a moment because I thought I must have misheard. "A shared what?" "A shared what?" "A neighborhood resource," she said confidently. The community paid for landscaping along the walking paths nearby, so naturally residents expect to enjoy the lake as well. I looked out across the water and then back at her. "This lake sits entirely on my property," I said calmly. "It's not part of your HOA." Karen smiled in the way people do when they think someone else simply doesn't understand how things work. "Well, according to our documents, it's listed as a community recreational resource." That immediately caught my attention. "Which document?" I asked. She waved a hand dismissively. "Our lawyers handle those details." That was the first red flag, because anyone who actually owns something can show you the paperwork in about 30 seconds. I told her again that the lake belonged to me. My family had owned the land for decades. The deed, surveys, everything clearly showed the property lines. Karen didn't argue directly. Instead, she turned to the residents behind her and said, "Go ahead, everyone. Enjoy the afternoon." And just like that, 4 people walked around me and headed toward the dock with fishing poles. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Karen genuinely believed HOA authority meant she could claim anything that sat close enough to the neighborhood. Over the next few months, the situation got worse. Residents started appearing at the lake almost every weekend. Some fished, others brought kayaks. A few even started leaving coolers and folding chairs near the shoreline like it was a public park. Trash began showing up too. Empty bait containers, soda cans, fishing line tangled in the weeds. So I did the obvious thing. I installed several Pirovet property, no trespassing signs along the edge of the lake. 3 days later, they were gone. All of them. I replaced them. A week later, those disappeared too. Then the letters started arriving. Official envelopes from the HOA board. The first one claimed I was restricting reasonable community access to a shared natural resource. The second accused me of damaging community property by interfering with HOA recreational planning. The third warned that I might be violating neighborhood agreements regarding shared outdoor spaces. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that last one twice, because I had never signed a single agreement with their HOA. Not one. My land wasn't part of their subdivision. It never had been. At first I ignored the letters. I assumed eventually someone on the HOA board would look at the county records and realize the lake wasn't theirs. But instead, the behavior kept escalating. More residents showed up. Some of them acted like I was the one trespassing. One man actually told me, the HOA said this lake belongs to the neighborhood. Karen even began discussing plans for community fishing days and lakeside events in the HOA newsletters. And every time I spoke to her about it, she repeated the same sentence. This lake is basically part of the community now. I still believed it was just arrogance. I didn't realize how far she was willing to go to prove it. Not until the morning I walked down to the shoreline and found dozens of fish floating on the surface. Dead. I walked straight over to the workers loading the chemical containers into their truck. Up close, I could clearly see what they had been using. The labels on the containers listed aquatic treatment chemicals, strong ones, the kind typically used by environmental contractors to wipe out fish populations when lakes are being restocked. You did this? I asked, pointing toward the water. One of the workers nodded casually. HOA hired us, he said. Said the lake needed to be reset. Reset? I repeated. Yeah, the other worker added. Too many people fishing. The board said the ecosystem was getting out of balance. This treatment clears things out so the fish population can be rebuilt properly. I stared at them for a second, trying to process what they had just told me. You're telling me the HOA ordered you to dump chemicals into this lake? Correct, the first guy said. Do you have paperwork for that? Without hesitation, he reached into the truck and pulled out a clipboard. That's when my stomach dropped, because right there on the work order was a signature. Karen Whitmore, HOA President, Willow Ridge Community Association. The document described the project as Lake Restoration and Fish Population Reset. The HOA had hired them directly, paid them, and authorized the treatment. I handed the clipboard back slowly and looked out at the water again. Dead fish were still drifting toward the shoreline. The workers didn't look concerned. To them, it was just another job. They had been told the HOA owned the lake, and they had treated it accordingly, which meant something far more serious was happening. The HOA didn't just think they had influence over the lake. They believed they actually controlled it. After the truck left, I drove straight home and pulled out the property documents my father had left me. The original deed. The survey maps. Every record tied to the land. I spread them across the dining table and checked them again, even though I already knew what they said. The lake wasn't partially mine. It wasn't shared. The entire body of water, shoreline, lake bed, and every inch of surrounding land sat squarely within my property boundaries. Even more important than that was a document attached to the deed, the water rights registration. It confirmed something extremely clear. The natural spring feeding the lake was legally tied to the land itself, which meant the lake and the water flowing through it belonged entirely to the property owner. Me. There was no HOA easement, no community access agreement, no shared ownership. Nothing. The HOA had just poisoned a privately owned lake without permission. Later that afternoon, I made the mistake of checking the Willow Ridge Community Facebook group. Apparently, Karen had already posted an update. Great news, neighbors. The board has taken action to address the overfishing issue at the lake. A professional treatment was completed this morning to reset the ecosystem. This will allow us to rebuild a healthier fish population for everyone to enjoy. The comments underneath were full of applause. People thanking the board. Residents praising Karen for protecting the lake. One person wrote, "Finally, Now we can organize real fishing events. Another added, maybe the HOA can install a dock and kayak rentals next summer. Someone else suggested creating HOA fishing permits for residents. Reading those comments felt surreal. Hundreds of people celebrating a decision that involved destroying property they didn't even own. But the worst part wasn't the residents, it was how confident Karen sounded in that post. Like she had every right in the world to make that decision. That's when I stopped treating it like a neighborhood dispute and started treating it like a legal problem. I called a local attorney my family had worked with years earlier. His name was Robert Ellis, and he specialized in property law. I explained the situation from the beginning. The lake, the HOA, the chemical treatment, the work order signed by Karen. There was a long pause on the phone after I finished. Then he asked a very simple question. Daniel, you're absolutely certain the lake sits entirely on your property? Positive, I said. I checked the deed again this morning. Another short pause. Then he said something that made the entire situation suddenly feel a lot bigger. If the HOA ordered chemicals dumped into a lake you legally own, he stopped for a moment before finishing the sentence. This just became a very serious problem for them. I asked him what he meant. He explained it carefully. Unauthorized chemical treatment of a body of water could involve more than just property damage. There could be environmental violations, wildlife destruction, even potential liability with state agencies. But before any of that could happen, he needed to see the documents. So that evening I scanned every page of the deed and survey records and emailed them to his office. About an hour later my phone rang again. Robert had already reviewed them. His voice sounded calmer this time, but there was a clear edge of disbelief in it. Daniel, he said, I've looked at your property maps. Yes? That HOA didn't just poison a lake. He paused again. They poisoned a lake they have absolutely no legal authority over. And that was the moment the situation officially changed. Because up until that morning, the HOA thought they were managing a neighborhood amenity. But from a legal perspective, they had just vandalized private property, on a scale that could cost them a fortune. Robert asked me to bring every document I had to his office the next morning. Not just the deed and the survey maps. Everything. Old property files. Tax records. Any agreements my father might have signed with the developer when the subdivision was first built. At the time, I didn't think there would be much to find. My father had always been extremely careful about paperwork, but the development next door had happened years ago. I assumed the HOA had simply misunderstood where the property line ended. Robert didn't think it was that simple. When I arrived at his office, he had already started pulling county records. Stacks of them. Subdivision permits. Development filings. Drainage plans. Environmental impact reports. By the time I sat down across from his desk, he already had several pages spread out in front of him. Daniel, he said, tapping one of the documents. I think I understand why the HOA believes they have some authority over that lake. He slid the paper across the desk. It was an agreement dated nearly 12 years earlier, around the time the Willow Ridge subdivision had first been built. The document had my father's name on it. It was labeled Temporary Drainage Authorization. I read through the page slowly. When the developer built the subdivision, they needed a place for rainwater runoff to flow. Instead of building a separate retention basin, they had asked my father for permission to allow excess stormwater from the neighborhood to drain into the lake during heavy rain. My father had agreed. But there were conditions, very specific conditions. The agreement was temporary. It allowed the developer to route overflow drainage toward the lake only while the subdivision was under construction. Once the project was completed, the developer was supposed to install a permanent drainage system inside the neighborhood itself. The authorization had an expiration date. 10 years ago. I looked up at Robert. So that agreement doesn't apply anymore? He shook his head, not even a little. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. That document gave the developer temporary permission to route construction runoff toward your lake while they built the neighborhood. But once construction ended, the agreement expired. The developer was supposed to create their own drainage infrastructure after that. So the HOA doesn't have any rights to the lake because of this, none. Robert pointed at the expiration date again. This permission ended years ago. Legally speaking, the HOA has no ownership claim, no access rights, and no management authority over your lake or the water flowing into it. That alone would have been enough to shut down their claims, but the situation was about to get worse for them. Robert opened another file on his desk. This is where things get interesting. He had requested copies of internal HOA meeting notes from the county records department. HOAs often filed certain documents when they approved neighborhood projects or maintenance plans. Among those files were several email chains between board members. One of them immediately caught my attention. It was sent about 6 months earlier. The sender was a former HOA board member named David Lynn. The message read, "I've been reviewing the property maps around the lake. I'm not sure we legally control that area. The deed lines appear to place the entire lake inside Mr. Carter's property." I felt a small spark of satisfaction reading that. At least someone on the board had done their homework. Then I read Karen's response. Robert slid the printed email closer to me so I could see it clearly. Karen Whitmore had replied just a few hours later. Her message was short. "The lake borders our community and residents use it regularly. For all practical purposes, it's a neighborhood resource. Don't overcomplicate things." David had responded again. "I'm not trying to complicate anything. I'm just saying we might want to verify ownership before making any official decisions about it." Karen's final reply ended the conversation. "It's close enough." That was it. 3 words. But those 3 words changed everything, because they proved something extremely important. Karen hadn't made a mistake. She had been warned multiple times, and she ignored it. Robert tapped the email with his pen. "This right here is going to matter a lot." "Why?" I asked. "Because if someone on the board raised concerns about ownership and the president ignored it, that shows negligence. Possibly even willful negligence." He explained what that meant in simple terms. If Karen had genuinely believed the HOA owned the lake, it might have been treated as an honest misunderstanding. But these emails showed something different. She knew there was uncertainty. She knew someone had questioned the legality of their control, and she chose to ignore that warning anyway. Then she authorized chemicals to be dumped into the lake. Robert leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, this case just became much bigger than a property dispute." "How big?" I asked. He opened another folder and began listing potential consequences: property damage, environmental violations, destruction of wildlife, unauthorized chemical treatment of a natural water source. Depending on how state regulators interpreted it, the HOA could be facing multiple investigations. And every one of those violations came with fines. Expensive ones. "But that's not even the worst part for them," Robert said. He pointed back to the drainage agreement. "If the HOA still has stormwater flowing into your lake through their neighborhood drainage pipes, they're technically using your water system without permission." I blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means the HOA has been benefiting from your lake as part of their infrastructure for years, without a valid agreement." Robert closed the folder slowly. "Daniel, you're not just defending your property anymore." He paused before finishing the thought. "You're preparing a legal case that could cost that HOA millions." 2 days after the lake treatment, the HOA announced an emergency community meeting. Karen posted the notice in the neighborhood group and sent emails to every resident in Willow Ridge. According to her message, the meeting was meant to address recent concerns about the lake restoration project and clarify future plans for community access. In other words, she planned to calm everyone down and keep control of the narrative. Robert saw the announcement that afternoon and called me immediately. "Are you planning to attend?" he asked. "I wasn't," I said. "It's their HOA meeting." There was a brief pause. "Daniel," he said calmly, "you absolutely should attend." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the Willow Ridge Community Clubhouse. By the time Robert and I arrived, the parking lot was almost full. Dozens of residents were already inside. When we walked in, Karen was standing near the front of the room with 2 other board members. A projector screen behind her displayed a large title, "Lake Restoration Update." She looked confident, relaxed, like someone who expected to explain a minor inconvenience and move on. But the moment she noticed me standing near the back of the room, her expression tightened. The meeting began a few minutes later. Karen stepped forward and addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming," she said, smiling toward the crowd. "As many of you know, the HOA recently completed an ecological treatment of the lake to correct the overfishing problem and restore balance to the fish population." Several residents nodded. Karen continued, clearly comfortable in front of the crowd. This temporary inconvenience will allow us to rebuild a healthier ecosystem for the entire community. Once the lake stabilizes, the board plans to introduce structured access guidelines and possibly expand recreational opportunities. Someone in the room asked about fishing. Karen assured them the lake would reopen once the restoration period was complete. That was when Robert leaned slightly toward me. "Now," he said quietly. I stood up. "Karen," I said. The room turned toward me. Karen's expression hardened immediately. "Mr. Carter," she said coldly, "this meeting is for HOA members only." Robert stood up beside me. "That's interesting," he replied calmly, "because the topic of this meeting appears to involve my client's property." The room went silent. Karen crossed her arms. "The lake borders our community," she said. "Residents have every right to discuss it." Robert nodded once. "Then we should probably clarify something important." He placed a large folder on one of the front tables and began removing documents. The first page he set down was the property deed, then the county survey map, then the water rights registration. Karen frowned. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" she asked. I stepped forward slightly so the room could hear me. "Just one simple fact," I said. I pointed to the survey map. "The lake isn't part of the HOA." Murmurs spread through the room almost immediately. I continued. "The entire lake, including the shoreline, the lake bed, and the surrounding land sits inside my property boundaries." A woman in the front row leaned forward to look more closely at the map. Karen shook her head. "That's not accurate," she said quickly. "Our community documents clearly identify the lake as a shared recreational area." Robert slid the survey closer to her. "Then I'd encourage you to review the county records." Karen didn't touch the paper. She just stared at it. One of the other board members stepped closer and glanced down at the map. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Residents began whispering to each other. Someone asked, "Wait, the lake isn't HOA property?" Karen raised her voice. "Of course it is. The neighborhood has used it for years." "That doesn't make it yours," Robert replied. He picked up the next document. "This is the official water rights registration tied to Mr. Carter's property." He held the page up so the front rows could see it. "Not only does Mr. Carter own the lake itself," Robert continued, "he also holds the legal rights to the natural spring that feeds it." The room became noticeably quieter. Karen's confidence was starting to fade, but she tried to push through it. "That's irrelevant," she said. "The community still has access." Robert shook his head. "No, actually, it's extremely relevant." He placed one final document on the table. This one looked different from the others. It was a drainage map. Karen looked down at it, confused. "What is that?" she asked. Robert spoke slowly. "This is the drainage system for the Willow Ridge subdivision." He traced one of the lines on the map with his finger. "Every time it rains heavily, stormwater from this neighborhood flows through a series of underground pipes." He moved his finger toward the edge of the map, and those pipes discharged directly into Mr. Carter's lake. The room grew completely silent. Robert looked up at the crowd. "For years, this lake has been acting as part of your neighborhood's drainage system." Karen frowned. "I don't see the problem." Robert leaned slightly forward. "The problem is that the drainage authorization allowing that water flow expired 10 years ago." A man in the back spoke up. "Wait, what does that mean?" Robert answered calmly. "It means the HOA currently has no legal right to use Mr. Carter's lake as part of its drainage infrastructure." Several residents exchanged uneasy looks. Karen's voice rose again. "This is ridiculous. The neighborhood depends on that drainage system." Robert nodded. "Yes, it does." He tapped the water rights document, and Mr. Carter controls the water rights to that lake. The realization began spreading across the room. Slowly, uneasily, Robert finished the sentence carefully. If Mr. Carter were to restrict or alter that water flow, hundreds of homes in this subdivision could face serious flooding issues during major storms. The whispering in the room grew louder. People were now looking directly at Karen. For the first time since the meeting started, she didn't seem sure what to say. Her earlier confidence had completely vanished, because the room had just realized something she hadn't expected them to learn. The HOA hadn't taken control of a community lake. They had picked a fight with the person who controlled the water system their entire neighborhood depended on. The morning after the community meeting, everything changed. Up until then, Karen had still been able to hide behind confident emails, carefully worded announcements, and the illusion that the board knew what it was doing. But once that room full of homeowners saw the county survey, the water rights registration, and the drainage maps, the story stopped being a neighborhood disagreement. It became a liability. And liabilities spread fast. By noon the next day, people in Willow Ridge were asking questions Karen could no longer brush aside. Residents wanted copies of the meeting documents. They wanted to know whether the lake really belonged to me. They wanted to know whether their homes were connected to drainage permissions that had expired years earlier. More importantly, they wanted to know why the board had approved chemical dumping into water they didn't even own. Karen tried to get ahead of it. She sent out an email to the entire neighborhood claiming there had been confusion regarding old property descriptions and that the board was working closely with experts to resolve a temporary legal discrepancy. She described the lake treatment as a good-faith environmental action taken in the community's best interest. That might have worked if the evidence had been vague. It wasn't. Robert had already filed formal notices with the county, the state environmental office, and the HOA's legal counsel. He also requested an emergency injunction preventing the HOA from entering my property, posting signage near the lake, authorizing any further treatment, or presenting the lake as a community asset in official communications. Karen responded the way people like her always do when they realize control is slipping. She denied everything, then she started blaming other people. First, she blamed the contractors. According to her attorney's initial response, the chemical company had supposedly acted on its own interpretation of what treatment was appropriate. Karen claimed the board only approved a routine ecological service and had not understood the scale of what would be applied. That argument lasted less than a day, because Robert already had the signed work order, not just a general authorization, a detailed work order. It included the treatment purpose, the timeline, and the approval signature. Karen Whitmore, HOA president. When Robert showed me the full copy, I read every line twice. Karen hadn't just approved vague maintenance. The document explicitly described a fish population reset and listed the chemical application zone as the entire lake basin. She knew exactly what she was signing. Then came the environmental investigators. 3 days after the meeting, a state field team arrived at my property with testing kits, clipboards, cameras, and enough seriousness to make it obvious this had moved far beyond civil paperwork. They photographed the shoreline. They collected water samples. They documented the dead fish, the chemical residue near the entry point, and the contractor tire marks leading toward the lake access path. One of the investigators asked me to walk him through everything in order. When I finished, he looked out over the water for a long moment and said, "Did they have any permits for this?" "No," I said. "They didn't even own the lake." He wrote that down without saying another word. Later that afternoon, Robert called me. "The environmental office is taking this seriously," he said. "How seriously?" "Serious enough that the HOA board may be personally questioned." That happened sooner than I expected. Within the week, Karen and 2 other board members were asked to provide records related to the treatment decision, meeting minutes, contractor invoices, email approvals, internal discussions, and property verification documents. That last part mattered, because there weren't any. No title search, no county confirmation, no legal determination of ownership, no valid easement, no active drainage rights, nothing. The board had acted as if confidence were proof, and once investigators started asking for documentation, that entire strategy collapsed. Residents began hearing rumors before the official findings even came out. Someone's cousin worked for an insurance adjuster. Someone else knew a clerk in the county office. Screenshots of the drainage maps from the community meeting started circulating in neighborhood group chats. People who had been praising Karen a week earlier were suddenly asking whether the board had exposed the entire subdivision to legal and financial disaster. They had. Robert filed the civil complaint the following Monday. It was brutal. Unauthorized chemical dumping, trespass, property damage, wildlife destruction, interference with protected water use, negligence, potential environmental violations, fraudulent representation of property control. He attached everything: deeds, surveys, water rights documents, the expired drainage authorization, photographs of the dead fish, copies of Karen's public statements, and the email where she dismissed ownership concerns with the phrase, "It's close enough." That one line hit like a hammer, because it stripped away every excuse she had. She could no longer claim she had no reason to question ownership. She could no longer say she believed the board was acting carefully. She had been warned. She ignored the warning. Then she approved chemicals anyway. The HOA's insurance carrier noticed that too. A week after the complaint was filed, one of the board members leaked what had happened behind closed doors. The insurer had reviewed the claim request and was already pushing back on coverage. Their argument was simple: if the board knowingly acted outside its legal authority, and especially if it ignored ownership warnings, coverage might be limited or denied altogether. That news detonated inside Willow Ridge. Because lawsuits are one thing, uninsured lawsuits are something else. Suddenly, homeowners weren't just worried about Karen being embarrassed. They were worried about special assessments, emergency fees, falling property values, and whether the HOA would force residents to pay for legal damage caused by the board's recklessness. For the first time, the anger turned inward. People stopped asking me what I planned to do. They started asking Karen what she had done. The HOA held another meeting, but this time it didn't look anything like the first one. There was no projector, no polished announcement, no talk of future lake access or improved recreational planning. Karen walked in looking exhausted, and for once she didn't sound in control. Several homeowners demanded a full explanation. One older man stood up and said, "Did this board verify ownership of that lake before poisoning it?" Karen tried to dodge the question. "We relied on long-standing community use and prior development assumptions." He cut her off. "That's not what I asked." Another resident spoke up from the side of the room. "Did you verify ownership, yes or no?" Karen hesitated. That hesitation told everyone what they needed to know. "No," she said finally. The room erupted. One woman demanded to know whether the board had risked everyone's dues to settle a fishing complaint. Another asked whether the lake drainage issue meant residents were living beside a legal time bomb. Someone else shouted that Karen needed to resign before she bankrupted the neighborhood. Karen, still trying to save herself, pointed the blame outward again. She said the contractors should have performed their own due diligence. She said the board had relied on inherited assumptions from the developer. She said no one could have expected the issue to escalate like this. That last sentence was the worst one she could have said, because by then everyone understood the truth. The issue had escalated because Karen had refused to verify what she was claiming authority over. And the deeper investigators went, the uglier it became. State testing confirmed measurable contamination from the treatment chemicals. The fish kill was documented. Wildlife disturbance was documented. The application itself had not been supported by permits tied to legal ownership or authorized resource management. In plain terms, the HOA had dumped chemicals into a privately owned lake without the right to do it. Robert called me that evening after receiving the preliminary findings. His voice was steady, but there was a clear sense of momentum now. "They're in trouble," he said. "I figured as much." "No," he replied. "I mean real trouble. The evidence is lining up cleanly. Civilly, they're exposed. Environmentally, they're exposed. And the judge is going to see exactly what this was." I looked out through my kitchen window toward the lake as he said that. Even from the house, I could still see the stillness in the water, the absence of movement, the damage they'd done just to prove they could control something that never belonged to them. "What happens next?" I asked. Robert answered without hesitation. "Now we take it to court." The hearing took place about 6 weeks later. By then, the story had spread far beyond the Willow Ridge subdivision. What started as a dispute over fishing access had turned into a full legal case involving property rights, environmental damage, and HOA liability. The courtroom was fuller than I expected that morning. A few residents from the neighborhood had shown up, along with reporters from a local paper that occasionally covered HOA disputes. Karen sat at the defense table with the rest of the board and their attorney. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked smaller than the situation around her. The judge began by reviewing the filings. Robert had organized the case carefully. Every claim was supported by documentation, and a timeline was impossible to ignore. First came the property records, the original deed to my land, the county survey confirming the lake's boundaries, and the official water rights registration attached to the property. Those documents alone established one fact clearly: the lake belonged to me. The HOA attorney tried to argue that community use over the years had created a reasonable expectation of shared access, but the judge shut that down almost immediately. Expectation does not override ownership, he said. Then Robert moved to the next section of evidence. He presented photographs taken by the environmental investigators, images of the dead fish near the shoreline, the chemical containers left near the access trail, and the tire tracks leading from the HOA path down toward the water. After that came the contractor documentation, the work order. The courtroom projector displayed the page so everyone could see it. At the bottom of the document sat a signature that had already become very familiar to everyone involved: Karen Whitmore, HOA president. The judge studied the page carefully. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, looking toward the defense table, "is this your signature?" Karen shifted in her seat. "Yes, Your Honor. And this document authorizes chemical treatment of the lake?" "Yes." Robert stood. "Your Honor, this authorization occurred without property ownership, without environmental permitting tied to legal authority, and despite prior internal warnings regarding lake ownership." Then he introduced the email chain, the one where a board member had questioned whether the HOA actually controlled the lake. The courtroom grew quiet as Robert read Karen's response aloud. "It's close enough." The judge looked up slowly. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "were you aware there were concerns about ownership before authorizing the treatment?" Karen tried to defend herself. "We believed the lake functioned as part of the community landscape. Residents had used it for years. That wasn't my question." The judge interrupted. Karen hesitated. "Yes," she admitted, "there had been some discussion." That admission changed the tone of the entire room, because it confirmed what Robert had already argued. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was negligence. From there, the case moved quickly. Robert outlined the full scope of what the HOA had done: unauthorized chemical dumping into a privately owned lake, trespassing through my property to perform that dumping, destruction of wildlife confirmed by environmental investigators, and the misrepresentation of property control to residents, contractors, and the public. The HOA's attorney attempted one last defense. He argued that the contractors themselves had carried out the chemical treatment and therefore shared responsibility. Robert responded calmly. The contractors acted under written authorization from the HOA president. They were told the HOA controlled the lake. That representation came directly from Ms. Whitmore and the board. The judge nodded slightly. Then he turned to the environmental findings. State officials had submitted a report confirming that the chemical application had caused a measurable fish kill and disrupted the lake's natural ecosystem. Restoration efforts would be required to rebuild the fish population and stabilize the water conditions. "Who will be responsible for those costs?" the judge asked. Robert answered, "The party that authorized the treatment." Karen looked down at the table. The judge closed the file in front of him and leaned back slightly before delivering the decision. "The court finds that the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association had no legal authority over the lake located on Mr. Carter's property. The HOA acted without ownership rights, without verified access permissions, and despite internal warnings questioning their authority." He paused briefly. "The chemical treatment ordered by the HOA constitutes unauthorized interference with private property and resulted in documented environmental damage." The room remained completely silent as he continued. "The HOA is therefore liable for restoration costs, compensation for property damage, and legal fees incurred by the plaintiff." Karen's attorney shifted in his seat. But the judge wasn't finished. In addition, the HOA is ordered to cease all representations that the lake is a community resource. All signage, communications, or policies suggesting HOA control of the lake must be removed immediately. Robert glanced toward me but didn't say anything. The judge delivered the final line clearly. "The lake is, and has always been, private property belonging to Mr. Carter." That was the end of it. Outside the courthouse, the reality of the ruling spread through the Willow Ridge neighborhood almost instantly. The HOA now faced massive restoration costs, legal fees, and potential insurance disputes over coverage. Residents who had once applauded the board's actions were suddenly demanding answers. Within a week, the pressure became too much. Karen Whitmore resigned as HOA president. Several other board members stepped down shortly afterward. The neighborhood elected a temporary board just to stabilize the situation and begin repairing the damage left behind. For the first time since the whole mess started, the lake was quiet again. But the biggest change wasn't the water. It was the way the neighborhood looked at that lake now. Because everyone finally understood something Karen had refused to accept from the beginning. The lake had never belonged to the HOA. And trying to take control of it had just cost them more than they ever imagined. In the weeks after the court ruling, the chaos around the lake finally started to settle down. For the first time since the whole situation began, there were no HOA emails, no warning letters, and no new signs appearing near the shoreline claiming the lake belonged to the neighborhood. The legal decision had made things very clear. The lake was private property, and the HOA had absolutely no authority over it. But winning in court didn't magically fix the damage. The fish were still gone. The water still looked wrong, and the shoreline that had once been peaceful felt strangely empty. The state environmental team returned a few days after the ruling to begin the restoration process. They explained that the chemical treatment hadn't permanently destroyed the lake, but it had wiped out most of the fish population and disrupted the natural balance of the water. Recovery would take time. They tested the water repeatedly over the next few weeks, monitoring chemical levels and oxygen levels. Once everything stabilized, they began introducing new fish back into the lake in carefully controlled batches. Watching that process was strange. For years, the lake had simply existed on its own, quietly supporting fish and wildlife without anyone interfering. Now there were trucks, tanks, and biologists carefully releasing new fish into the water one container at a time. One of the specialists told me it would take about a year for the ecosystem to fully stabilize again. But at least it would recover. That alone felt like a victory. While the environmental teams handled the water, I focused on the land around it. The dock had been damaged during all the activity near the lake. Contractors, investigators, and curious residents had all trampled the same access paths for weeks. The shoreline grass was worn down, and one section of the old wooden dock had started to rot. So I decided to rebuild it. Not anything fancy, just a stronger version of the same dock my father and I had built years ago. I spent several weekends working on it myself, replacing boards, reinforcing the posts, cleaning up the shoreline and removing the debris that had accumulated during the investigation. The work felt good, simple, honest. It reminded me of what the lake used to represent before the HOA turned it into a battleground. While I was working on the dock one Saturday afternoon, I noticed someone walking slowly down the path from the subdivision. For a moment, I expected another confrontation. Instead, it was a man I recognized from the community meeting. He stopped a few feet away from the shoreline and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Carter?" "Yeah," I said. He kept his hands in his pockets and looked out at the lake for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I set my hammer down. "For what?" "For believing the HOA," he said. "Karen made it sound like the lake belonged to everyone. Most of us didn't question it." He nodded toward the water. "I grew up fishing places like this. Seeing what happened here, it didn't sit right with me once the truth came out." I shrugged slightly. "People trusted the board. That's not unusual." He hesitated again before asking the question I'd been expecting for weeks. "Do you think the lake will recover?" "Yeah," I said. "It'll take time, but it will." He nodded once more, thanked me, and walked back toward the subdivision. That conversation turned out to be the first of many. Over the next few weeks, residents began showing up one at a time. Never in groups, never with the confidence they used to have when Karen was in charge. Some just walked by and nodded politely. Others stopped to talk. A woman who lived 2 streets over told me she had always suspected the lake was an HOA property. She said the board's explanations had never made much sense, but most residents assumed the leadership had verified everything before making decisions. Another resident admitted he had been one of the people praising the lake treatment online. "I thought they were fixing something," he said. "I didn't realize they were destroying it." Not every conversation included an apology. Some people simply wanted to understand what had really happened. But the tone had changed completely. The arrogance was gone. For the first time since the subdivision was built, people approached the lake with the same attitude my neighbors had years earlier. They asked permission. The biggest change, though, happened inside the HOA itself. About a week after the court ruling, Karen Whitmore officially resigned as HOA president. The announcement came through a brief email sent to all residents. It said she was stepping down to allow the community to move forward. But everyone knew the real reason. The lawsuit, the investigation, the court ruling, the insurance disputes. Karen had become a liability the neighborhood couldn't afford. Within days, 2 other board members resigned as well. The HOA held a new election to replace them, and the residents who stepped forward were very different from the previous leadership. They weren't interested in expanding HOA authority or claiming new community amenities. Their entire platform focused on one thing: preventing another disaster like the lake incident. One of the first policies they introduced was simple but important. From that point forward, the HOA would be required to verify legal ownership through county records before making any decision involving land, water, or structures near the subdivision boundaries. In other words, no more assumptions. No more "it's close enough." Every claim had to be backed by documentation. It was a rule that probably should have existed from the beginning. But sometimes communities only learn those lessons the hard way, and Willow Ridge had learned it in the most expensive way possible. By the end of the summer, the lake finally started to look like itself again. At first, the changes were small. A ripple near the reeds. A quick flash beneath the surface where the new fish had begun settling into the deeper water. The environmental team continued visiting every few weeks, checking oxygen levels and monitoring how the restocked fish population was adapting. One afternoon, a biologist standing beside me on the dock pointed toward the center of the lake. "You see that?" A circle spread slowly across the water. "First feeding activity we've seen in a while," he said. It might not sound like much, but to me it meant everything. The lake was coming back. As the months passed, the shoreline grew quiet again too. The constant traffic from investigators, reporters, and curious residents faded away. Grass grew back along the worn paths. The water cleared. Birds started returning to the trees around the lake. For the first time in nearly a year, the place felt peaceful again. And something else changed along with it. The people from Willow Ridge stopped treating the lake like something they were entitled to. They treated it like a neighbor's property. One evening, while I was sitting on the dock, a father and his teenage son walked down the path that ran along the edge of the subdivision. They stopped well short of the shoreline. The father raised a hand politely. "Mr. Reddert Carter?" "Yeah?" He gestured toward the water. "My son's been learning how to fish. We were wondering, would it be okay if we tried for a little while?" There was something different about the way he asked. Respectful. Careful. The way people ask when they know the answer could easily be no. I looked at the boy. He was holding a small fishing rod and looked nervous about even standing there. "Stay near the dock," I said, "and clean up when you're done." The kid's face lit up instantly. "Thank you, sir." They fished for maybe an hour before packing up and leaving the shoreline exactly the way they found it. That became the new pattern. People asked. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said no if the lake needed time to recover. But every single time they respected the answer. A few weeks later, I put up a single sign near the shoreline. It wasn't aggressive. It simply read, "Private Aleki. Fishing by permission only." And surprisingly, that one sign stayed exactly where I put it. No one tore it down. No one argued with it. Because the entire neighborhood now understood something that had been obvious from the beginning. Ownership matters. The HOA itself slowly stabilized as well. The new board spent months dealing with the aftermath Karen had left behind. They negotiated with insurance companies, worked through the legal settlements ordered by the court, and approved the funds required for the environmental restoration. It wasn't cheap, but the residents understood why it had to be done. The lake wasn't just scenery. It was part of the natural environment surrounding the neighborhood, and now that everyone knew it didn't belong to the HOA, they treated it with a level of caution the previous board had never shown. The new leadership even reached out to me directly a few months after the court case ended. 2 board members came to my house one evening. They weren't there to argue. They were there to apologize. One of them spoke first. "We can't undo what happened," he said. "But we want to make sure the HOA never repeats that mistake again." They explained the new policy requiring full legal verification before the HOA could make decisions involving land outside the subdivision. Then they asked if there was anything they could do to help maintain a better relationship with the surrounding properties. I thought about it for a moment. "Just remember something," I said. "What's that? Authority doesn't come from confidence. It comes from ownership and law." They both nodded. And that was the end of it. No threats. No arguments. Just a quiet understanding that the situation had been resolved. The strangest part of the entire story is what happened afterward. For years, the lake had been surrounded by tension. Residents treated it like something the HOA controlled. Karen treated it like a symbol of power. Every conversation around it had turned into a fight about who had the right to decide what happened there. Now that the truth was clear, all of that disappeared. The lake simply became what it had always been, a quiet place. Sometimes I'd see someone walking along the edge of the subdivision trail and they'd wave politely. Occasionally, someone would stop and ask if they could fish for an afternoon. And every now and then, I'd say yes. Ironically, the lake became more peaceful than it had ever been before the HOA got involved. Because once the illusion of control disappeared, people stopped trying to claim something that wasn't theirs. They simply respected it. And that was all the lake had ever needed in the first place. Several months after everything ended, I found myself standing at the same spot on the dock where this whole story really began. The lake looked completely different than it had that morning when I first saw the dead fish floating near the shore. The water was clear again. The reeds along the edge had grown back. Every now and then you could see a small ripple spread across the surface where fish were feeding just beneath the water. Life had returned, and with it, the quiet that had always made this place special. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized something important. This fight was never really about fishing. Fishing was just the excuse that started it. What the situation was really about was something deeper: ownership, respect, and what happens when people start believing they have authority they were never actually given. HOAs, companies, organizations, they all run on the same basic idea. A group of people create rules, and everyone assumes those rules must be legitimate because they exist. But sometimes, those rules start expanding beyond the boundaries they were meant to stay inside. And when no one questions it, that authority grows until someone finally pushes back. In this case, the HOA believed that because the lake sat next to their neighborhood, it was automatically part of their world. Residents believed the board must have verified that claim. Contractors believed the HOA had the right to authorize the work. Everyone assumed someone else had checked the facts. No one actually had. Until it was too late. Standing there months later watching fish break the surface of the water again, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The lake was alive again. Quiet. Still. Exactly the way it had always been before someone decided they controlled it. And in the end, that's probably the biggest lesson from this whole situation. Authority isn't something people can simply declare. It has to be earned, documented, and respected. Otherwise, sooner or later, reality catches up. And sometimes it catches up in a courtroom. So if you've ever dealt with an HOA or any organization that thought it owned more than it actually did, I'd honestly love to hear your story. Drop it down in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about real property disputes, HOA drama, and the occasional moment of well-earned justice, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Because around here, there are plenty more neighborhood battles waiting to be told.